Hey everybody, this is Politics by Jake, and we're back. This is the edition for June 28th, the morning of June 28th, 7 a.m., and let's get right into some of the comments. The idea of Politics by Jake is to give not so much a comprehensive overview of everything that's going on, but to focus strategically on certain things that are happening in the world that we here at Politics by Jake feel are important. And perhaps the most important, and it's certainly important to focus on the things that we feel are important here, to share those with you, our listeners. But an idea, hints or suggestions, sometimes explicit, sometimes implicit, sometimes you'll have to read between the lines for your personal intervention. Remember, democracy is grassroots. It starts with you. You hold the sacred franchise of the vote, and everyone, both nationally and internationally, are focused on this election in 2024 at this period of time. And we have a situation, for example, where Trump, who is the figurehead, and I stress figurehead, he's unfit for office. There's an argument that can be made that he is becoming increasingly demented. The polls have, even by the biased standards, and you know how I feel about polls, even by the biased standards of the push polls that are presented by propaganda organizations like Fox News and Rupert Murdoch, who is perhaps the chiefest among them, to try to make it look just like back in 2012, like Mitt Romney did. And people don't remember this very much, but just like Mitt Romney, who was so certain he was going to win. And I've described over periodically how he would, in the closing day or so of the election, he would say, it was just like watching Poltergeist. Remember that great actor in Poltergeist who played the psychic, Zelda Rubinstein? That was not her name. Her name in the movie was Tangina. But the actress was named, or the actor, pardon me, was named Zelda Rubinstein. And she uttered so many great lines. She had such great dialogue in that. And she talked about, and as if she was possessed, and speaking for the voice, the evil voice that she was kind of channeling, crossover, all is well, all is well. And it's this kind of thing that you're hearing from the Republicans, and they've been inundating you with it. And Mitt Romney did this in 2012. And I remember distinctly the day before the election, he said, just one more day now, and it'll be well. And of course, I'm kind of imitating the Tangina's character, Rubinstein's character in Poltergeist. All will be well. Cross over, children. All will be well. Just 24 more hours now. And of course, Mitt Romney lost. And the funny thing, the scary thing about that is that he himself had drunk the Kool-Aid so much and was so sure that he was going to win that he hadn't even scheduled for a motorcade of vehicles, because since he was the president-elect, he was going to be entitled to, government vehicles. And as a consequence, when it became evident that he lost, he wasn't entitled to that, and he couldn't get to campaign headquarters to give his concession speech because his staff had to hurry about and find vehicles to take him to the campaign speech or the campaign headquarters so he could give his concession speech. This is the scary thing, and you're seeing it. They're saying to you, we're going to win. Every time they put out these polls, they're saying, we're going to win. There is no point. You had better get in line. There's no point in voting for Biden because it's going to be us and we're going to win. And this has proven false time and time and time again. The Republicans don't do well with the national vote. And Romney, of course, is a good example of that. But you have this situation, and it's extremely important to keep perspective because we're going into some things that are, for example, Biden gives this incredible State of the Union address, which I, a younger man, could not have risen to the level of energy and consistency for the length of time that he spoke, which was something over an hour, and it was a very energetic speech that he did. And yet they're back at it again. every time you turn around on social media, there's some video or other of him. It's a doctored video showing him doing something, and they're putting their spin on it, indicating that he's old, and this is never going to quit because they're trying desperately to convince you that you should put someone who's plainly unfit for even the office of dog catcher, and someone who is increasingly becoming hard to ignore. And the funny thing about Trump is that he's already demented and crazy anyway, honestly. But it's getting worse. It's actually getting worse. And even Fox has had to admit that according to their own polls, Biden is up now by 4%. This is intolerable. They can't even hide it anymore. And so there is an all hands on deck call going on for all of the players, Putin, Xi, North Korea as well, and all of the other fascist influences, and some communists too. I mean, the mainland Chinese are communists, in order to shore up what they see as Trump's flagging candidacy. So we have these defeats of Trump, and we have, talking about one of the players, which is Putin, his defeats, and the fact is that their alliance is in big trouble. And we want to talk about the excesses and the lack of due process in the Hunter Biden trial. And as you recall, about a week ago, I had a discussion on that where we spent some time and we talked about that. And this is absolutely a scandal. And we also have the European elections to talk about. And we have basically these reactionary and these backwards. These are people who to vote for things that are going backwards. And fascist forces are attempting to use the European election. And this is why I say, folks, that we have an all hands on deck situation here where every single thing that can be done to convince you, the American voter, with the sacred franchise of the vote, and it is sacred, the sacred franchise of the vote, to argue that you should either vote for Trump or you should not vote at all, because there's no point, because these reactionary and fascist forces are so strong that they're going to win anyway. So you might as well get on the bandwagon so that you don't fall afoul of Project 2025. Yes, that's right. It's the Republican plan for a second Trump administration. And you recall we talked just on last week's show, or just really it was the show of a couple of days ago. And once again, this is all connected here. It goes to show, and this is why I do some of these segments that I do. It's to show you all the forces that are arrayed against democracy. And it's not just against the Democratic Party, it's against democracy, because these are fascist and reactionary forces with a little communism and a little no-name authoritarianism thrown in that are attempting to sway the election. The United States and you, the individual voter, are the focal point of the entire world's attention, and all the great players of the world who are on the high side of all the income inequality that exists in the world today are voting for you to not exercise your franchise or to exercise it the wrong way. And that's what we here at Politics by Jake are involved in, from the opposite standpoint, to resist and to point out these things. And getting back to what I was saying, on the last show, we had a discussion of the British, what I jokingly called the British invasion, the second British invasion. And it's not the Beatles and it's not the Rolling Stones, as I said there. It's the situation where the British tabloid monarchical journalists of Fleet Street have definitely invaded the United States. Rupert Murdoch, one of the chiefest among them, and I think you'd arguably have to say the chiefest among them. And they are attempting to influence in a monarchical way because, as I explained in the last show, they are part, culturally and socially, and their mores are part of a hierarchically stratified society. They are monarchists that happen to have, the common law. And they have a kind of a dual system. They have a king but they also have a relatively, just as long as you're willing to bow down and acknowledge the king, they have a relatively benign system. But the journalists of Fleet Street are here to impose that monarchical view, which is anti-democratic to the extent that monarchy is anti-democratic, and they are the journalists who represent that monarchical point of view here in the United States, and they are here. And in the last show we talked about that. I urge you to go back and listen to that segment. It's a great segment. There was so much involved in it that I couldn't even put it all out. I perhaps need to do another segment on that. But that's what's going on right now. The stakes have never been higher. The stakes are literally the end of democracy as we know it. The stakes are the rise and the success of fascism and authoritarianism, with consequences for this country that you have never seen before. Very literally the end of your freedom. And lest I get going on what's going on in the show and I run out of time, so I literally only have like 15 or 20 seconds at the end of the show, basically to just say goodbye. I want to advise you that if you like what you're listening to, we encourage you to listen. I have a lot more on my YouTube page, which is youtube.com/@politicsbyjake, where I have not only all these podcasts are there that you can listen to, but also videos of a lot of other material that unfortunately, because of time and because of the crush and because there's so much going on, that there isn't enough time even in 2 shows to get it all to you. We don't always get to on this show. I'm also on Facebook, where right now we're hoping to change that, but right now my page is Lawrence Jacobson, and you can go there. Twitter X, where my handle is JakeLaw08. That's JakeLaw08. You can see my political comments there, and I also sometimes talk about baseball and hockey too, but mostly political commentary. And we'll be back after these comments, and this is Politics by Jake. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back again to talk to you about one of these little wrinkles that can cause a lot of problems and a lot of happiness for people who actually want to own a business, or who have just started a business, or who have been operating a business now for some time. It doesn't really matter. My guess is that you wanted asset protection. That's one of the reasons for starting a business. You wanted to grow wealth, and you wanted to protect the wealth that you created, and you thought that a limited liability company or a corporation would be the way to do that. But did you know that just creating a corporation or a limited liability company does not guarantee that at all? Do you want to know if there's any way to fix that? Go to www.jakelaw.me. That's JAKELAW.me, and watch my video where I talk about this very important thing, and then set up a time where we can have a phone conference, or call me directly now at 573-454-1168. That's 573-454-1168. Call now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. And this is Politics by Jake. Now, let's talk for a moment, and I'm going to bring up something. I'm just going to do it in passing, and you may listen to this and you may say, what is Jake talking about? Just bear with me, I'm going somewhere. But let's talk about briefly the Council of 10 in Venice. This was a secret council, and it met secretly, and it delivered, for example, death sentences. It did so with impunity and secrecy. And it was one of those kinds of things where, in fact, there was a great movie with Johnny Depp called The Ninth Gate. And in it, there's a book that supposedly was written by the devil. And in this book, there are illustrations, and one of them is someone hanging from a lamppost upside down with one leg, with the foot of one leg juxtaposed against the other. And these are the kinds of things that would happen. You wouldn't know anything about these death sentences. You would either wake up in the morning and you would go out into the plaza and you would find the condemned individuals already dead, hanging there from a lamppost or in some cases they would be, put in a boat in the middle of the night and taken far out to sea, and they would basically be dumped. And that would be it. And you would never know what happened. And now compare that to the Supreme Court. We have here not a council of 10, but we have a council of 9. And they want to do the same thing. They want to give immunity to Trump. And never forget that these people, and this is just really important to understand, that these people, these justices who hold this high and unassailable position, because remember, their term is for life, right? They're basically unassailable, and they kind of act like this secret Venetian council used to act in a very real way. And if they vote for impunity, that means, if they vote for your immunity, that means they vote for a king. And there should be no kings in America. Now, Charles III of England, he's a king. He has absolute immunity. You can't go after him for anything. But there are no kings in America up to now. But of course, if you have people who want there to be a king. You have monarchical types in the United States, and they want there to be a particular king like Trump, who is unfit, who is probably demented from everything that I've been listening to. It's kind of hard to ignore. He's just in the news all the time. The news loves him because he's such a nut job who doesn't understand anything about government, who doesn't understand anything about the Constitution, who's only in it for the grift. He's only in it for the con, and he's only in it to get what he can get for himself. And he has said so. And moreover, he is only in it so that he can stay out of jail and continue the grift. And he's just perfect because he's already compromised. He's a known quantity. So he's perfect for the national and international players who want to buy the United States and the things that the United States has to offer. For example, Trump just recently offered, he erased the amount of money, it depends on how you look at it, I guess, that he would allow for the tax rate. He said he would drop the corporate tax rate by 1%, and now it's at 21%. And of course, Biden wants, the corporate types hate Biden. The money power hates him because Biden wants an alternative minimum tax of 25%, no matter what, on corporations. And he wants a 28% corporate income tax. And why does he want this? Well, he wants it because of some kind of uncomfortable truths. He wants it because we have budget deficits. And these budget deficits have to be rectified. And we know where these came from, don't we? That's right. You guessed it. St. Ronnie the actor. That's right. Ronald Reagan, who began these budget deficits that have seriously put the budget out of whack. And of course, he knew he didn't have to worry about it. If he ever gave it a thought, he knew he was going to be long gone by the time these things took place and came to a head where they are now and became serious. But unfortunately, we have to clean up for Mr. Bedtime for Bonzo, who is in reality nothing but an actor and who in reality knew nothing about nothing except how to say his lines and how to hit his marks. And of course, these corporations, these oligarchs, the money power, if you will, Wall Street, the hedge fund hyenas, all of those who benefit from the casino economy, the crypto fascists, all of these, they don't want to see that. That is, these increases in their taxes. Remember, you Americans who hold the sacred franchise of the vote, that these other players do not hold. Remember that when you go to the polls in just 130 some odd days, whatever it is, by this time it's about 130 days before the election, these people are against you. They must of necessity needs be against you. And the Supreme Court itself is against you. And why? Well, first of all, they're reactionary and they're fascist. And remember, the Politics by Jake working definition of fascism, it's not necessarily the Giovanni Gentile definition of 1922, but it's a good working definition. And that is that when you have backward beliefs, and we describe backward beliefs as, for example, women should have the vote taken away from them. That's a backward belief. That's a reactionary belief. Slavery should be reinstituted. That's totally reactionary. That's a backwards belief. So they're reactionary. And if they either perpetrate or support violence in the furtherance of their reactionary beliefs, they are fascist. And they want to destroy your freedom. And they don't think you should have it. And to prove it, they have at least partially destroyed Lincoln's new birth of freedom, which was the 14th Amendment. Alito himself has said this. And I have no doubt that Thomas and Barrett, who is herself a religious fanatic, who is a member of a Catholic sect, and this sect of which I speak, by the way, it's a kind of an ad hoc organization like Opus Dei. It's not like the Franciscans. And I want to take that back about Opus Dei, because the Franciscans, for example, using them as an example that pretty much everybody knows, they got a dispensation from the Pope in order to be the organizations that they are. Opus Dei may have, but the People of Praise, which is the ad hoc organization that she belongs to, I'm not so sure that happened. I'd have to look that up. But the People of Praise certainly exist, and they are a lay organization, and we've talked about them before, and probably we should go over that again. We won't do that now, but they're fanatics. And why? We've spoken about Barrett before, but to answer briefly, just briefly, without going into all of the things which are, quite frankly, even more egregious than what I'm about to tell you, if this wasn't egregious enough. She believes that the Bible ought to be preferred over the Constitution when deciding cases, even though nobody can agree on what it is that the Bible means after 2,000 years or so, or however many years, that by the writings actually began to be collected in and around the time of Constantine, I guess it was, and began to be organized in that way. And thanks to Anthony Kennedy, who is now gone, we have the case of Citizens United, about which Justice John Roberts wrote a concurrence that completely ignored the plainness of the constitutional imperatives about money being allowed into politics, and devised an argument that even talks about it, even has that in it, if you read the opinion, about the fear of giving political power to what is called aggregations of capital. That's the phrase that's used in the case, that the ordinary voter who has a franchise doesn't have. And as you might imagine, I've read it, it's very technical. It's the kind of thing that even if you're educated in the law, as I am, because my profession for a long time was that, and I'm still an advisor and a consultant, it expertly and adroitly and cannily ignores this entire thing. And it has the outrageous, boldness to actually say it. And then it goes on to ignore it completely. The main issue, political power in the hands of aggregations of capital. And it comes to a completely wrong conclusion. And so it is that we, to a great extent, because of Citizens United, have this situation where big money is allowed in politics. And we, the individual voter, who doesn't have the huge amount of money, the huge aggregation of capital, has to fight against these money power types who do have it. And by the way, lest you think I'm alone with regard to I realize that they're kind of upfront, a little bit outrageous statements about the Supreme Court and how wrong its decisions are. There's a recent article in the recent edition of The Atlantic, and it's entitled, Once Again, Originalism's Hollow Core is Revealed. And if you listen to me, I talk about originalism all the time, and I am not afraid to call it out and tell it like it is. Originalism is a constitutional heresy, and it consists of two components, legal positivism and textualism. And you can just combine them all together under one rubric, and that rubric is originalism. And this is an article, by the way, if you care to look it up, by Erwin Chemerinsky, and it's about the Rahimi case. And this is a gun rights case, and it came down on June 21st, and the writer says the decision was 8-1, Justice Clarence Thomas. It's United States v. Rahimi, and it was the lone dissenter. What the court didn't say but should have is that federal law is constitutional because the government has a compelling interest, a legal standard that allows the government to abridge certain fundamental rights in saving the lives of victims of domestic violence. And Chemerinsky goes on to say, instead, the court justified its result under an originalist approach. And you'll remember, other than me talking about it, it was Elena Kagan who, shocked the heck out of me in 2010 when she was in her confirmation hearings, when she said she wasn't even a member. She wasn't even a member of the court yet, but she was being, she had televised hearings and stuff like that. So I guess in a way it was kind of a foregone conclusion because they're all coached and they all know not to say certain things, who came out with this just outrageous statement because Kagan is perhaps less fascist and although I'm not sure I'd call her a centrist, but less fascist, less reactionary than the ilk of the judges that, like Barrett and Kavanaugh and Alito and Thomas, some of whom were appointed by Donald Trump, less than that. And she said, we're all originalists now. And Chemerinsky states, as I say, well, he goes on to say, originalism is the view that the meaning of a constitutional provision is fixed when it is adopted and can be changed only by constitutional amendment. So Chemerinsky, in his own way, is decrying what I decry, which is originalism. So at least I have some good company there. Apparently, Mr. Chemerinsky is the dean and Jesse H. Chopra Distinguished Professor of Law at the University of California, Berkeley School of Law. And he is the original author of Worse Than Nothing, The Dangerous Fallacy of Originalism. So he was a good one to pick for that. I wasn't available for that. They called me for that, but I said, call Chemerinsky. He's pretty good. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and I'm back. And what I want to talk to you about now is something I call virtual invisibility. No, not literal comic book type invisibility. What I am talking about is a practical invisibility, a kind of invisibility where you cannot be seen, where your personal transactions are shielded, where your business affairs are hidden from prying eyes, where a purchase of certain items is far less likely to be able to be found out by persons who have an intent to do you and your loved ones harm, the kind that results in the preservation and the protection of your personal assets, your business assets, all for your benefit and the benefit of your loved ones, the ones you are doing all this for in the first place. That's virtual invisibility. Crazy, you say? No, this exists. It's a thing. Want to know more? Contact me either at my website, www.jakelaw.me, or call me direct at 573-454-1168. Do it now. Become invisible now. And now let's get back to Jake and Politics by Jake. So, and getting back to the situation with immunity and the 14th Amendment, this is kind of interesting because guess who's in the White House now? A Democratic president. And so I'm actually really interested to see what the Supreme Court will come up with. There are some indications that they might send this back to Judge Chutkan. And Judge Chutkan, Tanya Chutkan, she's the judge in the January 6th case that is going on in Washington, D.C. And for some further, and they conjecture, they think that maybe they're going to send it back to her for some further briefing on the consequences of this, because the Supreme Court is actually really walking a razor's edge. I mean, they're on a tightrope here, because if they grant Trump immunity, then, the saying, salus rei publica supremus lex est, which means the safety of the republic is the highest law. I don't know whether Biden would do this or not. If it was me, I would be sorely tempted. He would be in a position where he could immediately arrest Trump. And he could immediately arrest the members of the Supreme Court, because there would be no way that he could be prosecuted for this. And the members of the Supreme Court, number one, they know what they're doing. They're energized. They consider this to be like a war. It's von Clausewitz that said politics is like a war. And he was right about that. Newt Gingrich also said it, but he neglected, arrogant jerk that he is, to tell anybody else that he was just quoting von Clausewitz. So they consider it to be a conflict. They consider it to be a zero-sum game. Alito himself recently said that there is no living with the other side. Either one side is going to win or the other side is going to win. There's no rapprochement. There's no modus vivendi, and that means a kind of a way of living so that you can live with the other side and not kill each other. And the implicit thing is that, as I said, you can live with each other without killing each other. But that's not the way it is with them. In their opinion, one side has to win, and the other side has to lose. I think maybe John Roberts might think slightly different than that, at least in his public statements. But these other ones, they're pretty much that way. So this is their mindset, and they very much are this way. And it's important that you holding the sacred franchise of the vote, who are the last line of defense and the best line of defense against the imposition of a fascist dictatorship and the destruction, not only of the form of government, but the destruction of your economic lives. I mean, talk about kitchen table economics here. And this has consequences for that as well. And the Supreme Court, as I said, knows this. And as a consequence of this, they may come out with some ruling that grants some immunity to the president, but not enough to get themselves and the other coup plotters and supporters who are among them. And in the case of Clarence Thomas and probably Justice Alito as well, it's their very own wives as well, who are either plotters or supporters. And I'm thinking of, for example, Ginny Thomas, Clarence Thomas's wife especially. But it's evident, moreover, from recent events with this, bizarre story that's been hitting the news of the flags on properties owned by Justice Alito and his wife, that if she is not a plotter, and I'm not, really accusing her of that in this particular case, Ginny Thomas more, not necessarily Alito's wife, she's definitely a supporter, and that much seems evident, and that's the appearance of prejudice. And I think that's beyond constitutional tolerance. In State v. Rippo in 2017, the Nevada case, that was talked about, I prefer the appearance of prejudice. But I think that's beyond constitutional tolerance when dealing with such fraught issues as presidential immunity. So, in other words, they have to make sure they don't get themselves in trouble. And remember, in the Constitution, and who knows but what the Supreme Court may get rid of this too, there's no such thing as an ex post facto law. And an ex post facto law is something that has retroactive effects. So in other words, a court could come out and could say that something is a crime that in previous times hadn't been a crime. And if they didn't have this ex post facto clause, all of a sudden people who had done a certain thing when it was not a crime, they're now criminals. And that's what that means. You can't have a law that is retroactive to things that happened in the past. So the Supreme Court is really in kind of a pickle here. And it'll really be interesting to see what they do, whether they just punt, whether they send it back to Judge Chutkan, as I said, for further briefing or further commentary, or if they decide and they make a decision. But as I said, and it's just really important to stress this, the 14th Amendment, and you have, my listeners, since you've got Wikipedia, since you've got Google search, you can look it up if you don't believe me. It's called the New Birth of Freedom. And it is one of the big reasons why Lincoln is referred to as a founding father. Oh, and by the way, the reason it's called the New Birth of the Freedom is because the rights granted in the amendments to the Constitution are applicable to the states. Before the war, they were not applicable to the states. And this is something that is not commonly known. So it's that very definitely is a new birth of freedom. If there was nothing else, if there was no other reason why you could call it a new birth of freedom, that in itself would be something, and that would be huge. And the Supreme Court in the Colorado case that came before it attacked that and made Section 3 null and void and of none effect. And if you don't think that was on purpose, if you don't think that they have an axe to grind, if you don't think that what they did constitutes an attempt to destroy that birth of freedom, now firmly established for, this 150 years since, then I would basically say, you ought to turn off the show, go listen to reruns of Rush Limbaugh, who's surely rotting in hell somewhere, because I have nothing for you. No kings in America. Give us back the new birth of freedom. No secret councils. And this is Politics by Jake. And now let's pause for a brief commercial message. Hi, this is Jake with Twain Consulting, and have you ever tried to get a business credit line? If you did, what's one of the unpleasant things that you found out? You found out that the only way that you can get business credit is if you personally guarantee each and every single loan, each and every single commercial credit line. Now, let me ask you this question. How did that make you feel? If you're like me, I would feel like they were giving with one hand and taking away with the other. If this bothers you, I encourage you to go to my website, www.jakelaw.me, where I talk about this this and several other important products and services that can benefit really almost all people listening to the sound of my voice. Call me at 573-454-1168 so we can talk about this, get mad about it together, and see if there isn't some sort of solution. That's www.jakelaw.me. That's JAKELAW.me, M-E. That's www.jakelaw.me, and the phone number is 573-454-1168. And now let's get back to Politics by Jake. He's talking about some very interesting things here, and you'll want to stay tuned. So without further ado, back to Jake. This is Politics by Jake. And let me go further with what I was talking about here, and let me say that this is really kind of a constitutional crisis when you think about it, because the plain facts of the matter is that our Supreme Court, as I have elaborated on in the previous segment, is bribed. You have Clarence Thomas, who, so far as we know, is absolutely the tip-top aspect of this. And, you know, he was born in a place called Pinpoint, Georgia, and he was actually in very difficult financial circumstances early in his life. And, you know, I want to be fair when fair I can be. And for people who have money waved at them when they've grown up in poverty, it's kind of something that sometimes they can't avoid. And boy, Clarence Thomas sure hasn't avoided it. He's taken approximately $4 million in bribes from people who had business before the court. And not only did he take the money, but when the business came before the court, he wouldn't recuse himself. Alito is less, so far as we know. He's taken about $200,000. But the amounts are important, but the point is, this is a crisis. We have a court that is bought and paid for, and we have a court that we can't rely on. We have a court that will not recuse itself when people who have business come before it, who have been paying these judges and bribing them with all sorts of things. This is just an extreme constitutional crisis, which is one of the reasons I talk about it so much, and I talk about the Supreme Court justices and the other justices. Let's not even get into Eileen Cannon, who I will mention here just briefly, the yoga and dance correspondent for the Miami Nuevo Herald at one time, and her husband, Johnny Rosati, who has mob connections, although I hear that is just basically he's a contact for purchasing cars, but it's the mob who wants to purchase them, who jurists in the 11th Circuit are increasingly urging to get off the Trump documents case, but she won't do it. And why won't she do it? Because she's in the tank for Trump. She is a maggot. And this is her chance to protect the person who granted her her appointment. She's beginning to get in a lot of trouble, though, so we'll see what happens on that pet story as that continues to unfold. And recently she has sua sponte, which means basically on the court's own initiative. They can bring up stuff. If they want to bring up something, they can do it. It's called sua sponte. Brought into question the legitimacy of the prosecutor himself, Jack Smith. So really, what you have is a secret combination, don't you? Except that in this case, it's really not so secret, is it? I mean, here at Politics by Jake, we believe in secret combinations. Frankly, we don't see what the big fuss is about, and we qualify our remarks by saying that we do not believe in conspiracy theories, and we draw a distinction. We do not believe, for example, some of the ridiculous things that are always coming out on social media, like, for example, and this is a famous one from a while back, the situation with Pizzagate. That's the one I always like to refer to, where there was a pizza parlor in D.C., and it was allegedly operating a pedophilic sex ring, which means, you know, sex with children, down in the basement, and Hillary Clinton was behind it, allegedly, furthermore. And this has had several iterations. This was so popular. It first came out in around 2010, but it has resurfaced at least 2 more times as a consequence of this, and there's no basis for it. This particular piece of parlor doesn't even have a basement, first of all. And apparently someone was so energized by this, and this is kind of the idea, because this is stochastic. And we've talked about stochastic terrorism. We've talked about stochastic remarks and what those are, and that they're designed to appeal to ideologically driven, and I love the definition on this, ideological, ideologically driven. Actually, I would say, if it was up to me, I would say fanatically deranged, frenzy-driven individuals in order to get them to take action, which is entirely an anticipated thing that they would do. In other words, the speaker knows that there's a likelihood that someone is going to do this if the speaker puts these stochastic statements on their social media or in their speeches. But because of the Brandenburg test, which is an old case from, I believe, 1969, there's a lot of insulation for the speaker on this. So we don't believe in Pizzagate, and we don't believe in such nonsensical kinds of conspiracy theories, but we do believe in combinations, and we do believe in secret combinations. The idea that business, political, and religious leaders would get together among themselves, out of sight of the public, out of sight of the holders of the vote, to make plans that they don't want ordinary men to know about. What I'm talking to you about right now is one, and those are combinations. Honestly, they're not so secret. I mean, hello? Project 2025, hello? Donald Trump talking about a unified Fourth Reich. And we've talked before about Project 2025 on this show. We shall do so more, and we're going to talk briefly about it right now. Gene Trevino recently favored us with a post where you have Kevin Roberts. And who is that? Kevin Roberts is the president of the Heritage Foundation, that when we have talked about on this show before, and just to give you a little idea of the Heritage Foundation, they're an ad hoc organization. You could call them a think tank, I guess. And you know, honestly, if you go to their well-constructed website, their well-constructed Wikipedia page, you don't get a lot about them that would lead you to be too terribly concerned. They call themselves conservatives, but that is a label they all hide behind because they're reactionaries and or fascists. But what is most pertinent to talk about here is that, and remember, we're talking about secret combinations. He's the lead organizer of Project 2025. And among other things, he stated the following with regard to Project 2025. He says, quote, "The basis of the plan is public. You can see that at project.2025.org. But he also goes on to say, quote, "There are parts of the plan that we will not share with the left. The executive orders, the rules, the regulations, just like a good football team. We wouldn't want to tip off our playbook to the left. The basis of the plan is public. You can see that at Project 2025. So, of all the things that could be said about this, it's interesting, for a couple of reasons. Number one, you have to ask yourself the question almost right away. Okay, you're not going to share it with the left. Who will you share it with? Well, the answer is he's not going to share it with anybody. They're not going to tell you what's going on, but they also tell you, and as my colleague Keith Olbermann likes to say, democracy is not so much saved by the energy and zeal of those who are trying to save it, but by the stupidity of those who are trying to destroy it. And they always put their foot in their mouth. And in this case, he says there are executive orders, there are rules, there are regulations. And you ask yourself, my goodness, what could these executive orders be? You mean they already have executive orders trotted out and ready to go on day one of the Trump dictatorship, which he himself has said that it will be? This is just all very troubling. By saying that and listening to the rest of what he says, it's easy to surmise that Project 2025 is even worse than what we may have read or already heard about. You'll notice, like I said, he mentions the executive orders, which leads me to believe that whatever was not written in the 920-page Project 2025 is so horrific, so horrible, so authoritarianistic, so unlawful, so unconstitutional, that even they did not want it to be made public. But let's go further here. Also, thanks to Gene, we have a recent social media post where the Reverend Robert Schenck, who is the president and founder of the Dietrich Bonhoeffer Institute, is speaking to a House committee about secret meetings that he was present for. And in his testimony, he says this, quote, "I'll take you to one very telling event. A meeting inside the U.S. Capitol with Republican Party operatives and a number of leading evangelical spokespersons, institutional leaders, ministry heads from across the country. And in that meeting that I participated in, the conversation went something like this. You guys want Roe v. Wade overturned, right? We can do that for you. But you have to take the whole enchilada. You have to take the whole thing. You take everything else that comes with it, because if you want Roe gone, you have to work with this. So you take it all." And I was at the table. I watched my colleagues, not uncomfortably, but from that point on, the community that I had served and still do made a deal with the devil. And that deal was that we would support everything on the conservative agenda. Whether or not we had conscientious conflict with it, the means were justified by the end of that. And the questioner who's asking him is Barbara Lee, and she's a congressional representative for the 12th District in California. And she asks, after he says that, she asks, quote, "And it also meant that you had to approach the Supreme Court in a different way, that they had to be influenced?" And Schenck replies, and he says, "Well, certainly we had to do everything we could to ensure that the justices would be resolved to begin laying the groundwork for the reversal of Roe." So, okay. The premise is the combinations, either completely secret or semi-secret, of religious, political, business interests that want to create a certain reality and combine together to do that. It's just as simple as that. It's very easy to understand. It's not rocket science, and it's not far-fetched by any stretch of the human imagination to think that this would be so. And I've just given you two examples of exactly that. So let's go further. So we have the judiciary, which we now know, as I have shown, is corrupt and controlled by money. We have the example of Clarence Thomas, and we've said that he's not the only one. I think he's by far the premier one, having taken $4 million basically in bribes and graft in order to, and I'm just reiterating what I said before here, to make decisions on cases where really he should remove himself because he's taken the money from these people who have business that these people bring before the court. But of course he hasn't, and he won't, and neither will Alito. And neither of them will recuse themselves from the immunity issues that are coming before the court. And they actually already have. The argument was on April 25th, I think, and they're still waiting. They're not doing a decision on it. And again, you have Eileen Cannon down in Miami. That's a whole other thing. How Trump got Eileen Cannon as a judge, because judges are chosen at random. You just can't walk into a clerk's office and say, I want Eileen Cannon on my case. That doesn't work. That doesn't work at all. With ordinary people like you and me, this would never happen. But somehow it happened for Donald Trump. But moving on with this. So we have a clear attempt to capture, by forces domestic, forces international, the government of the United States. So we've talked about the judicial aspect of it. We've talked about the executive aspect of it, because obviously they're trying to put these forces, are trying to put Donald Trump, this unfit, this unfortunately increasingly, which, is funny, because Donald Trump, when you listen to him, he sounds deranged all the time. But apparently he's becoming more and more deranged. And, he's getting more elderly and more likely to have, senility issues or dementia issues or some other organic brain syndrome like Parkinson's that would make him this way. And you have the legislative aspect of it. You have, in the House of Representatives, you have MAGA Mike, as he is called, MAGA Mike Johnson. He's the speaker right now. He has control of the House, even though it's very narrow. This control, it's still a control. Nonetheless, and he has stalled for 6 months aid to Ukraine. And why did he do it? He did it because Donald Trump told him to. And this is the consequence of it. Think about this. Many Ukraine defenders were killed. Innocent civilians, including women and children, were butchered. Russia took ground in Ukraine that ordinarily, had Ukraine been properly supplied, they never would have been able to take, and which actually now they're being pushed out of. I think the most recent news that I've gotten is that they have been pushed out of Kharkiv, and they had recently been in there, but they've been pushed out, and which we now see Ukraine has, been properly supplied. They're devastating Russia on the battlefield. Horrible numbers of casualties on Russia's side, in excess of over 1,000 a day. But because Johnson single-handedly, because of his blind obeisance at the altar of Donald Trump, and, Johnson is a fanatic. He's an election denier. He says he doesn't think, although, he may say that he doesn't think the election went for Joe Biden. He thinks it went for Donald Trump. He's just quiet right now because he's gotten into a situation where he's in some power, and he's basically doing Donald Trump's bidding. Johnson was a direct cause of these things, as was Trump. But Trump needed somebody to go along with him, and Johnson was in control of the House. So he was a direct cause of these things. He has blood on his hands. And honestly, it would not surprise me to find that the International Criminal Court is looking at issuing a warrant for his arrest for Nuremberg-type crimes against humanity. Among them, conspiracy to commit genocide of Ukrainians. So, again, you have a combination of the business and the religious and the political. You see the judiciary is basically captured. And what I'm doing here is I'm laying all this out for you. The judiciary is basically captured. I've laid that out for you. You'll hear the Republicans talk about capture, by the way. And they usually talk about it, regulatory capture. And you have seen that they're trying to capture the presidency. And you see that they have captured one of the houses of Congress. This is what it is. And this is what I'm trying to do here as we approach a crucial inflection point in the history of the nation and the world. Number one, to show you what the elements of this are, to show you that in many cases they are already in control. And I'm trying to point out to you that you're the last bastion. You, the voter, you, my listener, all around the country. And for those of you who are listening in other parts of the world, you're the last bastion against these barbarians at the gate. You have the vote. You have the sacred franchise. And it's important to understand just exactly what's going on. And I'm trying to make that as plain as I can for you. And this is Politics by Jake. Okay, and so that's the end of our show. Once again, all too small an amount of time to go into some of the things that we want to talk about, but stay tuned. We will be back with another edition of Politics by Jake, Monday morning, 7 a.m., July 1st. It'll be a brand new month, and we'll continue to be talking about these things. There's so many interesting things to talk about. We've got the Civil War issues at Gettysburg, Vicksburg, which basically happened at the same time and were decided at the same time in July of 1863 coming up. And I would love to get into the history of some of that stuff. The one thing that I can say is that those battles were inflection points in the history, or turning points in the history of the Civil War, and also in the history of this nation. We likewise, too, in 2024, are at an inflection point and a turning point as far as our governmental system is concerned in this nation. Whether we are going to allow secret combinations, which I have listed and talked about and quoted as being in existence in this show that I've just done, whether we're going to allow a captured judiciary, whether we're going to allow fanatics, both political and religious, whether we're going to allow ideologues to take over this country, whether we're going to allow the Heritage Foundation to implement the infamous Project 2025, about which I have spoken, or whether we're going to stand for freedom. It's unfortunate that on a beautiful weather such as we're having in this beautiful country that we have to talk about this, but we do. So that's it for now, and we will see you again Monday morning. Until then, have a great time. Bye now.